Welcome back to another episode of Reading Rehab. I am Mike Brown, joined by,
Brian Gardner.
And Pat Healy.
and a little before this, we were having some technical difficulties, so hopefully there's not some really long, awkward pauses. But anyway, this week we're talking about athlete health and human performance will not improve without transdisciplinary collaboration and data sharing in elite sport. This was published in the Journal of Athletic Training in 2024 in a very provocative title. Yeah, it's not super long, which is nice, but a little before we hit record, we were kind of talking about how it was a little bit of an underwhelming article. But we did make a note that it is an editorial. So it's not like, in theory, we're probably not really learning anything new in this. It's just more of a call to action than anything. I know, Brian, you talked about a little bit of this stuff off air. Do you want to, I guess, elaborate for the listeners now?
Yeah. I mean, so this article was written by an athletic trainer in the athletic training journal. And it's kind of interesting that they use this sort of two types of models is what they kind of go through, the high performance model and the medical model. And they kind of use the term athletic training being more of a under that medical model, which they kind of go in, and I don't want to say they make it like it sound like that's a problem and creates a lot of siloing compared to other I guess jobs within like a high performance or within sort of like a department that takes care of athletes. So, but they also give sort of like explanation on why like the high performance model is also has its problems as well, which I appreciate too, because it's like one is not necessarily better than the other, because if one was better, everybody would be doing it. So it's kind of trying to figure out how to mesh these two sort of, I guess, models together. And that's where I think they get with the transdisciplinary collaboration side of it. So I think that's where we can kind of dive into, I think, seeing, okay, what are the problems? How do we fix it? What does that look like? They also go into some interesting data sharing stuff at the end. They kind of, this article keeps, I mean, what I take from it is that they just make fun of all the problems that we have within sport, like RTCs and how that's a problem and it takes too long or it costs too much money. And we don't find out for a few years later that what we're doing is actually not what we're supposed to be doing. So I think that's another interesting. To be honest, this article was like kind of all over the place.
I agree.
So I don't know. Like, I think we try to keep it to talking about transdisciplinary versus, and then we can talk about the data sharing side of it. Just as two different conversations, because they go into these two different sort of thought process and then try to mesh it into one article and in a very short article.
Yeah, definitely. Brian, I was actually curious because you have had more experience in sports than the two of us. Like, have you been in, I guess, thinking of these in theory, the two models, the medical and the high performance model, have you been in, I guess, in situations that you would identify as one or the other? And I guess, what were your thoughts in those situations?
Yeah, I would say I've probably been associated with both types of models, and is in the high performance model, I had a direct performance director, which they allude as like the person that is like dealing with everybody underneath them, and then kind of divvying that information to front office, owners, etc. Um, that seemed to create conflict, especially because of it was a new way of doing things within the organization when I was brought on. So there was people that were under the assumption that medical model was like superior, and then this new model was brought in, and again without sort of having that common language which they talk about, things tended to um, just increase in conflict, and then things fell apart and things weren't so great. But then the medical model I've been a part of, where it's been more of a like, here's your head athletic trainer, you have your head S&C, you have your head of sports science, and then the head of like the ATs are entering into one system that doesn't communicate with other systems, and then we're using one system for sports science per se, and that's kind of communicating with our S&C stuff. So there was a lot of double entries and a lot of like, how do we figure this all out, because we don't have access to this. So it's from a collection standpoint, you almost had to go out of your way to like know what's going on in the medical side. And this is just coming from my own personal experience as a sports scientist, where it was like, in order for me to kind of look back at the data that we were collecting on all these athletes and injuries, I had to take my own sort of like intake of injuries on a daily basis. That way I could have like try to develop correlations on like whether it was a spike in load, whether it was acute chronic issue, which they do talk about in this episode, this article, which how that is not really a thing you can lean on, which I appreciate that they talked about it. But like I said, I think what they did was talking about the transdisciplinary collaboration is it allows for like multiple practitioners to have an understanding of a lot of different things so that there's a lot of crossover. I think that's allowing that. And I think that's where I think having a department where you have like athletic trainers that want to take like an S&C course, or you have sports scientists that want to take a physiology course on injuries, I think would be something that would benefit. I've also talked with organizations that have a handbook for their whole department of like, this is how we do stuff. So they do have sort of like a common language when it comes to whether you're S&C sports science nutritionist, sports psychologist, AT, PT, whatever, massage therapist, as long as you're using what is within that. And then the organization that I'm referring to would meet at the end of the year, and say what did and what didn't work, and then how do we adjust it, was kind of like what the off season was for. Um, so I think the better way to do it, because again, people are all going to have different thought processes, and it's like, in order for like a big department to work with having multiple people have multiple inputs, you have to agree upon specifics things, in order for one, the players not to notice that there's conflict, two, the front office knows that like it's not a shit show, pardon my French, so that you can then one, keep your job, and two, be able to give a good product on the other end. So I think that's important. I think there's, again, every organization is going to do it differently depending upon who the personnel is. But I think what it comes down to is having people that are willing to work together and collaborate is where it's going to start. And then I think having a common language is going to only emphasize that sort of like positivity and being able to kind of provide the right care and performance wise for those athletes. Sorry,
Yeah, for sure.
I went on a rant there.
I feel like one of the things. No, that's good. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think one of the key parts of like the transdisciplinary aspect that's most important, I guess, which I feel like maybe they didn't get into this in the article, and this is just like my thoughts on what it means to be like truly transdisciplinary versus interdisciplinary, is your like, as a PT, I care about what the nutritionist, what the athletic trainers, what the sports psychologists, like what everyone has to say, and that I try to learn more about like what their role is, what their job is, not so I can take that from them, but so then I can better ask questions of them and understand how they fit within the whole system. Um, where I feel like, yeah, in the transdisciplinary, it's like you take, if everyone's a bunch of circles and there's like overlapping Venn diagrams, you just like blur all the borders. So it should be hard to tell like where is AT versus PT versus S&C, like how do you delineate between those? Like there's certain areas that each one is I guess more suited for. Um, but the transition between all of them should be blurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're alluding to, and I think the word performance therapist comes to mind. I know that that's a new phrase that physical therapists are using, especially in pro sport, because again, it comes down to the performance end of like making sure that when they return or when they're getting ready, their performance is as high as it can go. Because again, if you're an NBA player, which they do talk about in the NBA and load management, um, that way you're providing a performance side of it, not just like a physical therapy. Because I think a lot of people view, and just this is just what physical therapy is sometimes viewed as, is like everybody's hurt, but not everything that a physical therapist does is just to get you back. It's to also improve that sort of performance side of it. um so I think that's where you're getting those blurred lines, is performance therapist versus physical therapist. So it's coming down to just title in itself.
Yeah, I also, I guess one other thought I had while I was reading this too, and I feel like it was kind of, maybe it was one of your critiques of the the high performance model, is that um, it almost, I guess the way they were talking in this, it felt like almost an AI could take place of that like performance director role, or like even in this figure 3 where they say like all of the sports medicine, nutrition, S&C, coaching, sports psych, like everything is going into this data broker, turning raw data into an integrated model of information. Like I feel like that's just an AI. Like maybe not now, but that feels like the future is like having some sort of AI system that then compiles all the data appropriately and can help with the synthesis to make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that, because I mean, pretty much the input is coming from the practitioners, and then they put it into one system. And I think with the way AI is kind of going, I think instead of having a performance director take that information and divvy it to front office or whatever, it will be able to be turned around a lot quicker. With the AI system, I think it's coming down to being able to also like develop sort of whatever that information said stakeholder wants, based on their needs, also, because you're putting all this in. I think that's where I get with the silos of like, you have one medical system, you have one athlete management system, you have all these other things that are being inputted, but they never get put into one thing, all at once. Because again, I think it's like, oh, I'm going to keep this, so I make sure that my job is secure. Where I think the AI is going to allow you to input it, but you still need that person to input it, but it's going to give a better result on the back end, because it's going to be able to push back faster, like the information, is where I think sport is going to go. Is like, it's not just about like all this data, but it's like, how fast can you make decisions based on whatever's being inputted.
Yeah, and I see that in the like in their section where they have like the bullet points of like sports nutrition says this, sports psych says this, S&C says this, and like a AI could very easily like flag all of those things and then be like, oh, there's X amount of flags, like we're sending that off to whoever, to then like act on that, versus having like a person who everyone talks to, or that person has to check it. Like there's just, I feel like innate error in there. Pat, you've been quiet. Have you?
I've been
do you have
I've
any
been
thoughts?
stewing. Yeah, I've been brewing over here. My cold brew brain with this article. Um no, like I can't really say I have like much more to add to this conversation, truthfully. I just I guess the only thing I found interesting was the last bit where they were trying to put forth the like real world, was it RWE,
Evidence.
real world evidence. And that's just like a, I don't know, it's definitely an interesting idea to try to tackle this whole like problem that you were talking about, Brian, where it's like in sport, you know, they brought up the fact that in pharmaceuticals, like things have to be tested so much, but like if you're in sport, you can make something and say it works and not be tested for its validity or reliability, until it's like already out there in the hands of thousands of people. And so I don't know how much of this like RWE is enough to like build upon for like actual practice, but I think, I don't know, just off of like the one paragraph section they have written about it, it's like, oh yeah, like I don't know, passes the sniff test, you know. It's like if we need just something to find like some kind of correlation, like I don't know, like if you're just trying to like gather a bunch of possible correlations in your brain because like you might be younger in the industry or whatever else, like I don't see it being a negative per se, as long as you just, you know, have those little yellow flags in your back of your mind when you're looking into it.
Yeah, I mean, I like this like the way that they look at it. It's almost scary for practitioners, is the way I look at it, because it's potentially looking at it from a way of making sure what you're doing is actually working. Because again, say you do something for X player and they go back in and said, "Oh, if you would have done this differently, you would have had him back faster." Or you put him at more risk, or then he got re-injured because you did this. So I think that's where it becomes a little bit scarier, because what they talk about is using these sort of like people to go into your whatever, and then they look at, and their example is we had 20, like they had 22 athletes get injured wearing this protective device and 78 were not injured wearing this device, therefore a device works. So they should basically, is what they're saying, is that these so-called RWE experts are often not knowledgeable in sport, but they will be less knowledgeable in and about the data being recorded, so they don't have any context into it. But I think what's going to happen is that they're going to use this sort of expert to go in and say what you were doing was bad, which could potentially make you be really good at your job or potentially make you lose your job, depending upon if they found correlation on if what you decided to do with these individuals worked or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I would be intrigued how it plays into their figure 3, the transdisciplinary, because then I feel like that kind of, I don't want to say it negates that whole idea of like you're just inputting the data of what you're doing and the results you're getting. And it's like all being fed through to, you know, check for any like major signs and all that. So in my mind, it's like, well, how can you, unless it's like very obviously like one thing that happened, but with these RWE experts, how could you just like come in and point the finger when it sounds like the whole point of like the transdisciplinary is to make sure that like you're taking the whole span of everything the athlete is going through that could be possibly causing, you know, injury. See what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think this potentially could be useful for front office on whether or not keeping said clinicians or not, because it's, say we're using this data broker as an AI system.
Mhm.
It person is entering data and this is saying one aspect, and then they go against, say the practitioner goes against that, that gives like some
Mm.
sort of reason to of,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? I think that's where you're going to go down that road
Yeah.
of your job might be under scrutiny every time you
Yeah.
make a decision,
Yeah.
because the AI is telling me one thing and you're doing the complete opposite, and are the results the same or different? And then said person could then make a decision on whether or not you made it the correct decision versus not the correct decision. So I think you're going to get into a lot of different things going on between practitioners wanting to take jobs that have this sort of implementation, and if that were to kind of come about. But I don't think we're
Mhm.
there just yet, but I think that is on the horizon, where you put in all this, just because like athletes are now making their own teams, like they have all these data input that they can take from all these different devices, which we talked about on a previous podcast, even though they might not be reliable or valid just yet, or but it's also, again, it's what the athlete wants, because in the end, especially in elite sport, the athletes are the product. They are the entertainment, so whatever they are going to get, they have a lot of power. So if they're saying that I have all this data input and it putting into this my own sort of data broker, could that potentially go against what the team is recommending? Could get a little messy in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, a couple quotes that I feel like from the article that I feel like go well with just this topic of conversation, is they say injury prevention is a team effort requiring structured and trusted data sharing. Um, so I think again, the team effort part is definitely within that, and then like having this system that is reliable, at least internally. And then they also say clearly there needs to be a culture at your local organization that learning what doesn't work is just as important as learning what works. Um, so that's definitely a big culture piece that like you can't necessarily control unless you're one of those one of those higher up positions. So kind of like what you were alluding to earlier, Brian, where it's like maybe if the organization for whatever reason just wants to know what works, like they don't have the time or the bandwidth to allow for many mistakes, it might not be a very conducive environment to, like, I guess, for clinician mental health, essentially, like, because you're always second guessing yourself, potentially. That's kind of one thing I was taking from what you were saying, is like there you could almost be like worried to make decisions, um, because you don't want to make the wrong decision in some of types of systems and cultures.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're also going to
But I
the
feel like
fact that
that's
it
kind of
costs.
getting away from the article.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're getting to the point where it also costs money for these organizations potentially. Um, so they're going to want the best outcome when it comes to financial gains or losses, to minimize either losses or like be able to get that player back faster, because I think that will provide better outcomes for the team, which is potentially increased revenue. So and I think it also allows the I guess the discussion of load management too, because you're allowed, these systems will potentially allow you to automate whether or not someone should rest, instead of just based on just minutes played or like this kind of thing. So it allows you to have something to stand on a little bit more than just say, oh, you just played too many minutes last night, we're going to rest you for, you're only going to play 10 minutes because, and that's like telling LeBron James, like, sorry, bud, but you can only play 5 minutes tonight. The NBA loses millions of dollars if LeBron James does not play more than 10 minutes. So, I mean, I think from a league standpoint and a team standpoint, you want to try to maximize what you have while trying to minimize risk of injury, when it comes to load management. But I think this is where that sort of system allows you to have all this input from all these different sort of, I guess, clinicians and entities to allow you to make better informed decisions. I think that's where this sort of system is going to go. And I apologize to people listening to this. We're way off topic, but I just find it super interesting because I think AI will be a very huge like part of our future when it comes to healthcare. Just because it's just moving so quickly. So that's kind of my little rant on that stuff.
Yeah, I agree that AI is the future. We just need to be creative in how we use it. Um, but I feel like that's a good place to wrap up. It was really laggy and choppy for us, but hopefully it's not like that on the audio. If it is, we apologize and appreciate that you listened this far. But anyway, this has been another episode of Reading Rehab. As always, if you enjoy what you listen to, please leave us a nice review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and follow us on Instagram at Reading Rehab Pod. Thanks.